Now, Ross has already introduced this sequence of courses by speaking about the values of socialism, and he's generous enough to do 2 sessions, and in this case, he will continue with the social democratic post-Second World War attempts to, in some ways, relate. Let's not be grandiose and say realize, but at least in some ways incorporate or relate to the values of liberty, equality, solidarity. Okay, so Ross, welcome.
One of the things that is interesting is that when Bernie was introduced socialism into the sort of rhetoric of American politics for the first time, a real achievement. When he was asked what he meant by socialism, he sort of gestured towards Sweden and social democracy. And what I remember is that in the days when social democracy was triumphant, in the waning days in the 70s, when I was a youngish leftist, we all thought social democracy was a complete sellout. But of course, when one thinks of the kinds of things that Bernie identified with social democracy, like decent welfare system, public health system, things like this, think, fuck, this is stuff that's something to be valued. And so I want to look at it in a kind of critical and reconstructive way. There was a lot wrong with the practice of social democracy, but a lot of things that were right about it, and we should learn from the things that were wrong about it and try and it's one thing, something that's sort of an aspect of the success of neoliberalism over the past 20 or 30 years was in the sense in which they've created a memory of the previous period of one of corruption, stagnation, mediocrity, inefficiency, and things like that. So I think to some extent we want to interrogate that memory and interrogate that history. So what is today is a very minor step in that direction. When I talked to this class last, I talked, as Andrew mentioned, about Axel Honneth. And Axel Honneth, I just want to mention 2 things about Honneth's position. One, identifying the values of socialism. He identified freedom. And when I was talking about Honneth's position, I said, oh, that was right. And he gave an account of what he meant by freedom, roughly what he called social freedom, notion of freedom, which I think is freedom which involves the recognition of equally free others. It follows on from Honneth's views about the importance of recognition and things like that. And for him, freedom is a kind of social relationship between individuals who recognize the equal freedom and value the equal freedom of others. And it's that kind of relationship between people. And I said that one sense of freedom that Honneth was part of this socialist tradition and part of the democratic tradition, you find it in Rousseau, for example, was a more vertical notion of freedom. It's a notion of freedom consists of being ruled by yourself, not simply in the individual autonomy sense, but that you are ruled through institutions which represent your views or in some sense an extension of yourself. This is, if you like, a democratic notion of freedom, and one aspect of the socialist tradition is to try and project that notion of freedom onto a whole range of social relations. So you find in Marx the idea of freedom consisting of controlling the conditions of one's economic existence, things like that. Now, I want to say a little bit about that later on. I just want to mention that in passing. The second point that I wanted to criticize Hart about was his views about when he talks about how we might build socialism, how we might construct a notion of socialism appropriate to the values that he finds embodied in the socialist tradition. He talks about experiment. And so his notion is that we look at experiments and the kind of things he has in mind. He takes a lot from Eric Wright's views, social experiments of cooperative works, of self-help communities, of banking and things like that. And what was remarkable about this is that he doesn't talk about the major experiment in my lifetime, which was the experiment of social democracy in the post-war period. That experiment, which is now retrospectively by Bernie Sanders identified as socialism. Now, whether or not we're going to call it socialism or not, that's something we might talk about. I want to say something about that experiment and how it emerged. And particularly about how it emerged in the post-war period. And I'll especially be talking about England. If I have time, I'll say a little bit about Sweden. And Sweden is very interesting, and I would like to talk more about it, and I wish I knew more about it, but we'll talk a little bit about it. But my main example will be Great Britain. Now let's begin. I think we can locate two, as it were, conceptual roads towards social democracy. One conceptual road, if you like, is revisionist Marxism. Those Marxists who lose faith in certain aspects of the classical Marxist doctrine about revolution, the economic determinism associated with some forms of Marxism, things like that, the kind of revisionism associated with Bernstein and others. So that sort of revisionism takes the form of, okay, at least in some countries, we're gaining or going to gain universal suffrage, that is some sort of representative forms of government. So we will ultimately aim to gain political power through universal suffrage and use the political power to institute economic changes, institute whatever structures we identify with socialism. Part of the socialist program, in this view, is to win the battle of democracy, win enough people on side, gain political power, and use the political power to institute the kinds of reforms, radical reforms if necessary, to institute some form of socialism. That's the model. Okay, revisionist Marxism goes in that direction. To some extent, once you get universal suffrage, even radical Marxists are led in this direction. Because once you have universal suffrage, you have the opportunity to make changes. And if you don't seize that opportunity, you're going to lose whatever support you have. So as soon as under a democratic system or a representative semi-democratic system where the working class and working class representatives have some sort of political presence, they're going to use that political presence, and the pressure on them to use that leads you towards a kind of what we now identify as social democracy. Now, the other conceptual road to social democracy is liberalism and liberal democracy. And that's very important in the English example, but other examples, well, the English example, I'll just talk about a bit. The road from classical liberalism to what we call social liberalism moves from a loss of faith in the market, a loss of faith in the market delivering all the goods that classical Marxist theory, and this involves problems about monopolies and things of this kind, but also, more interestingly, a critical engagement with a broadening of classical liberal values of freedom, equality, justice, things like this. So you get, as it were, the idea that a certain notion of freedom is superficial unless it takes into account the social conditions, access to education, access to resources, things like that. So a notion of freedom which just talks about political freedom is certainly superficial, and so on for equality. You get the same kind of argument of a deepened notion of democracy, that if you're going to have a genuine democracy of equal votes for everybody, you've got to have equal access to social resources, political resources, things like that. Even with radical liberals, you get the notion that democracy can be extended to not simply political institutions, but economic institutions like the workplace and things like that. So you get a certain kinds of convergence. You've got certain traditions, other traditions, which somehow feed into socialism as we understand it in the 20th century. And some of those traditions, particularly the liberal democratic tradition, is very important both in Britain, just also in Sweden. Say something about that. Okay. My remit here is post-war social democracy. And if you like, some of the people involved in this movement identified as socialists, others did not. I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about at some point what we mean by socialism, what we ought to mean by socialism. Put that aside to one moment, just think of, okay, what happens in the post-war period? A lot of Western countries, but England, my example, is that after the war, you get a Labour government elected to power and with quite a radical program. Why does war make a difference? It's actually interesting. After the First World War, most of the powers involved in that war broadened democratic participation. Marx says somewhere that revolutions are the locomotive of history. Things move faster. Actually, oddly enough, wars make things move faster, not just in terms of destruction and things like this, but the war means you've got a mobilization of people, a lot of people engaged in working together, a lot of people making sacrifices, and in that, after the war, there's a movement to recognize that. And that happens in all these countries, all Western countries, even in this one, even the United States. During the war, the state plays an important role, directing the economy, directing the war effort, organizing everything. And because the state is victorious, after the state has much greater prestige. People are used to the state making decisions. And the state represents the people, it represents the people against the enemy. So there's a lot more faith in the state being able to do things. In Britain, the war government was a coalition government. That it was a conservative prime minister, Winston Churchill, of course, but the Labour Party were represented in significant parts. And one thing that, while Churchill was busying around getting in the way of generals and telling them what to do and stuff like that, a lot of the people in the Labour Party were working on things like social planning, rationing, things like. One of the things they discovered, I think this is something really telling, because of the problems, the blockade and a rationing system had to be introduced. The rationing system had to be introduced, so they came to work out something like the minimum standard of living for everybody. So what people had to eat in terms of vitamins and bulk and stuff like that. And they discovered that a really substantial percentage of the population were improved when they got the minimum. The standard of living got better under these conditions. And it gives you something like the standard of living prior to the war. There was a famous report reports on post-war planning, Beveridge report, things like that, which were providing a lot more knowledge of what was wrong with the country. And so after the war, unexpectedly, the Labour Party not only won a majority, but they won a substantial majority in the 1945 election. And they're in power for the next six years. Now, I'm going to say something about their achievements there. Oh, one significant feature, by the way, of this, one of the conditions for the parties being able to start doing important things, the Labour Party was a trade union party. And the British trade union movement was still powerful. So that there was an alliance, or was a difficult alliance, between the political party and the trade union. The trade union was institutionally part of the Labour Party, so that there was this connection between trade union politics and Labour politics. All right. The other condition, which is very important, this is the next section I'm going to talk about, was Keynes. Prior to the war, in England, as in other countries, there had been a depression. Massive unemployment, massive poverty. As in America, in America, you got the New Deal. In Germany, you got Hitler. Both cases, very different motivations. You get the government playing a large role in reorganizing the economy. Both of those movements were sort of not theoretically informed. At the same time, Keynes, of course, was writing his important work with having a big influence about the role of the state in organizing, coordinating capitalist economies, avoiding slumps, responding to slumps and things of that kind. Okay. Let me make some, I'll go back to England in a moment, the achievements. I want to just talk about the role of Keynes, and I want to do that by looking very quickly at some of the points that Klaus Offe makes in his article, which I hope you've read or at some point looked at, on the contradictions of the social welfare state. Offe says that we should understand social democracy as the result of a kind of peace treaty between labor and capital. There's certain concessions made by both parties, the conditions of the peace treaty, and the welfare state is the outcome of that peace treaty. What on the part of capital, the main concession is acceptance that the government has a major role in providing a range of non-wage benefits. That is the benefits we associate with the welfare state. That is education, housing, health, things of this kind. So there's certain basic minimal conditions, social conditions, which will be guaranteed by the government. Also, the other concession, capital accepts that the governments can have a role in economic planning, management of resources, guidance, things of that kind. Finally, something that Offe mentions, which is surprising to American ears at least, the role of trade unions is institutionally recognized. They're recognized as part of the system, a political part of the system. So they're consulted and they're consulted. All right. They're the concessions made on the part of capital. What are the concessions made by labor? Now, interestingly, Offe doesn't say very much about those concessions. What's implicit in what he says is that the welfare state, the reforms of the welfare state don't interfere in the labor process. In other words, the reforms change the conditions under which the wage contract is undertaken, division of labor, capital, but not what happens afterwards, not what happens inside the factory, as it were. So what's left intact is capital's control of the labor process and capital ownership of the means of production. Those things are so that the social contract appears with the sort of market aspect, not the production aspect. Now, what of course this means is that the other part of the concession labor makes, which is the core of capitalist relations of production, stay intact. Nationalization is limited, though it takes place, but mainly it's assumed that the major aspect of the economic process will be under the control of capital. Now, what he doesn't say very much about is what the framework is. What's the background in terms of which the two parties, as he presents them, labor and capital, can come to this agreement? And the conceptual framework is Keynes, Keynesian economics. And that's really very important. Because what Keynesian economics provides is that the government has a role in, as it were, sustaining the conditions of capital accumulation. That the government role is to avoid slumps and to manage slumps when they occur, and so on. So by and large, Keynesian policies are designed to guarantee the conditions for continued capital's profitability over time, so that they're basically the economic input of Keynes. However, how it can do that, and this is the, as it was, social democratic input, is to provide, for example, the social democratic input, okay, let's move towards some sort of fundamental equality. That is by taxing capital and providing non-wage benefits to workers, things like that. Now, that level of redistribution is both justified perhaps on moral grounds, but it's also justified on economic grounds, because it's just that redistribution which allows for consumer consumption to deal with slumps and things like that. So by and large, you've got this really comfortable accord. Keynesian framework, however it's understood and whether it's actually accurate to the letter of Keynes, provides the framework which there's a kind of congruence of motivation. Congruence, the conditions of social democracy are basically the conditions of continued capital accumulation. Now, that's the framework. Now, of course, there are disagreements all the way through, but the disagreements can be limited by the general acceptance of that basic congruence. So the obvious weakness in this flaw is that the social democratic program, what is conditions of providing welfare benefits to workers, to non-workers, things of this kind, health system, are all conditional on the health of capitalism. The system's got to be working. These features assist in its working. What happens when it doesn't seem to work? All right, but for at least until the late 60s, early 70s, by and large, that worked. All right, let's get back to the achievements of social democracy within this framework. United Kingdom, in retrospect, it's quite astonishing. England was absolutely impoverished by the war effort. Obviously, this was after 6 years of war. What was provided was a national health system, still exists. By and large, the achievement of full employment. A great level of housing. Just a personal anecdote. One of in the Margaret Thatcher years, public housing was sold off. And some friends of mine are living in inner city London, and they're living in what was built in the post-war period as working class housing. And I was struck by the fact you've got quite near the Barbican, this very large area cut off from traffic, a lot of small apartments, all opening out into the large area, some high-rise buildings for small apartments for married people, high-rise building for unmarried people or couples without children, social sports facilities, swimming pool, health facilities, and a large area where people can look out and their kids can play. There's also nurseries and things like that. So whoever designed this stuff had some sense of how a community might live together. And in the city, where there's obviously in those days still the idea of the one male wage worker, women work, but also a place where it's very easy for people together to support each other, where kids could play in the open air unsupervised because there's no cars, our parents could look out, things like that. And it was kind of a small Eden. Now, that's of course, there are other places like this. We can think of people involved in the rebuilding who had some sense of how, in this case, working class communities might live together and organize their lives together. Now that's the kind of thing that should be remembered. And in this case, it's remembered in the sense because it's the stuff being sold off. So middle class people are now living in this. Okay. The achievements in the British system were made even under the really economic problems of shortages and things like this. So it's considerable achievement. Other countries, I mean, so I'm talking about England, as usual, the United States is an outlier. Lots of reasons why the United States is an outlier. One reason, the trade union movement in this country was defeated or marginalized early in the 20th century. There's no strong trade union movement. And in all the places where there's a kind of large social program associated with social democratic parties, it's almost always, I think always, in association with a strong trade union movement. So when we get to this is something I don't talk about, is one of the problems of the changes in the economic structure of places like England, the move away from industry to other forms of economic activity is a progressive weakening of the trade union movement, and that's something that is very significant in the weakening of the social democratic movement. Now, I've mentioned, it's interesting, I find it interesting to read Offbeat, read Crossland. I'm going to talk a bit about it in a moment. Texts that were written around about the time, even Offer. But Crossland, writing in 1956, is, and the document that I asked you to read, the book, and the extract from the book, that Crossland was a Labour Party minister, and he was an active politician. He represented the right wing of the Labour Party. And this book is actually part of a conflict within the Labour Party where he's trying to argue against the socialists in the Labour Party who strongly believe in nationalisation of all the major resources, much stronger forms of economic planning. So Crossland's argument is, look, what is socialism about? It's not about, we must not confuse, he keeps saying this again and again, means and ends. Socialism is about goals. The goals he identifies are full employment, security of employment, guarantee of minimal standard of living, free education. And he said, well, the point here is not to concentrate on the goals and see how best to achieve them. And if we are achieving them, that's what socialism is. So it's a mistake to think of something like nationalization, socialization, public ownership as important. If we can achieve these things and maintain private ownership, well and good. That's still socialism. So he thinks, A, that ownership is not important. And he has interesting reasons which were kind of interesting, not irrelevant now, but very characteristic of the 1950s. One of the arguments came up from ex-Marxists, like James Burnham and others. They said they're providing analyses of the Soviet Union. And what they were providing analyses, because they were Marxists, so they're looking for the class structure of the new Soviet system. And they said, well, the new class structure is the managers, the bureaucrats, the people who run things. It's not the formal legal ownership, it's rather who has the control, who makes the decisions. So this fed into a notion of a managerial revolution. So that capitalism wasn't about owners, it was about managers. That is the administrators, the people who had the executive positions. And then the argument, you get this in Galbraith and a few others, is the idea that this class of managers have different motives. They're not interested in profit maximization, they're interested in technological advance. Security, long-term planning, things of this kind. So you find in Crossland a recognition, look, capitalism has changed. We don't have the old system of owner bosses, we have the technocrats, the managers in charge, and they have this different sort of motivations. It is not, we've now got full employment, we've now got government, and to the extent that those motivations are different, they can also be controlled by the state. Because in a democratic system, we will decide what the main avenues are. We will decide on levels of taxation and things like this. So what you're getting is an idea that capitalism has changed. Nature of socialists should take into account these changes, take into account the fact that they now have the kinds of economic, political power to introduce these changes. Now, oddly enough, Crossland is writing this when the Labour Party is out of power. The Tories are back in power. But what he's saying is, look, even the Tories agree to this. Because, and here, the importance here is strong belief in democracy, the effectiveness of parliamentary democracy, and a strong belief in the Keynesian framework. But now it's the common sense of everybody that controlled. It's not the market that designs things, it's the state guiding the market. And once you've got the idea the state can guide the market, then you can introduce things like health systems, public welfare, and all the wherewithal of the welfare state. All right. I might come back to Sweden at the end. I'll skip Sweden just for the moment. To some extent, yeah, no, I'll skip Sweden. I want to talk about the two countries. The left critique of social democracy, and then I want to talk about the right-wing critique of social democracy. The left critique of social democracy was and is important, in some respects wrong. The right critique was much more important because it was successful. But the left critique of social democracy, basically the idea that the managed capitalism was simply the appropriate form of late capitalism. Just as the free market was the appropriate form of the early stages of capitalism, what we had now after the recession, after the depression, after Keynes was the recognition that managed capitalism was the way to go. So social democracy was simply clever capitalism. A point that Perry made, social democracy is concerned with conditions external to the labor process. They didn't, as it were, look at the heart of capitalism, which they followed Marx, was in the production process. So that in order for labor to have a say in the production process, this was Anderson's argument, the ownership relations had to be changed. The ownership relations had to be changed to give workers a say in how labor was organized. With the Labour Party in power, with the trade unions working at least in some sort of coordination with the government, there was no place for direct action. Indeed, it was important for the relationship with capital to work, for the TC to work, that direct action be muted. So the kind of sense that socialism had to involve, and this was part of the Marxist and radical tradition, somehow it was the direct action, what was done on the factory floor, what was done by individuals acting together of their own thing, that was terribly important. I hope I then have time to come back to this point, because under any system, any viable system, there's got to be restraints on direct action. In the case of, or this I mentioned something which may or may not come out later, if you're going to have a coordinated, even in traditional, coordinated working class movement of any kind, the traditional kind, if the Labour Party is simply there as the voice of the coordinated working class movement, if that's going to exist, quite apart from people outside the working class, and they're important, then the power of some unions has to be diminished while the power of other unions increased. In other words, some workers in some industries will have a position by their own direct action, by strike or whatever means, to do deals which are good for them, but all things being equal, it's people in weaker industries who are going to pay for those deals. workers in weaker industries. So if you can have a coordinated working class movement, you've got to have some way of limiting the power given to direct action. Now, that was one of the problems of social democracy, but it's a problem that's endemic in any situation. Strong argument was that the way the welfare state worked was one that it never gained for people who were, let's say, the bureaucratization of the welfare state, this is the terms that were used then, was another form of oppression. Even those who benefit from the welfare state felt that the bureaucrats, the people organizing, were the same bosses, the same people who were telling them what to do, indulging them, not treating them as they make their own decisions, and so on. The thing about the welfare state was that it never attracted the love or even the gratitude of many of the people who were its recipients. A personal story, back in Australia, many years ago, I moved into a working class area. I bought a small house. And I was what we call part of the gentrification. We didn't have that term then. And where I was living, there was a hospital, and had bought lots of houses where people worked. But the hospital was organizing itself. We were selling these houses, and some of the people in the house, a lot of people in the houses were old people, pensioners, things like that. And so I was even involved in helping them organize against this selling off. And we won. They won. So at that stage there was a left-wing, a Labour Party in power in the state of New South Wales, and some of the people in the housing industry said, well, we'll buy that. Not only will we buy the houses, but we'll renovate them, and the people living there can continue to live there, because it's important they live in the same area. So this old lady living opposite me, who was I liked, and we got on well, and after it was all finished, she didn't move back into her own house. She moved just down the street. But it was really well done. Nice little house. I saw her, and she complained all the time. It was, everything had been done. She now had a renovated house, but still she felt no gratitude in the people to live it for. So somehow the thing was that the welfare state never attracted the commitment or loyalty, or never enough commitment of loyalty of those who benefited from it. All right, let's see, I've got, yeah. I want to go back now, perhaps we'll have something more to say about now of other left-wing criticisms of the welfare state. Let's look at the right-wing criticism, and then I want to say something about neoliberalism. Let's get back to Offer. He identifies two right-wing criticisms of the welfare state. One of them is the disincentive to investment. So, well, the argument is that capitalists aren't going to invest in new forms of production. They aren't going to do the creative things that capitalists love to do, because it's too expensive. There's too much taxation. You have to pay for the government for too much stuff. So they won't invest. Further, given that workers, would-be workers, have a lot of non-work benefits, non-wage benefits, they have less incentive to work. And because they have less incentive to work, they'll either be happy not to work, or at least they'll be in a position to only work under good conditions, so they don't have to work so hard or work less hours or things like that. So there'll be a problem both in the incentive to produce, there'll be a problem in the quality of work and the cost of work. Now, Offer says both these criticisms have a certain validity. The interesting point about the makes here is it's not as if they have to be valid in any real sense. They have to be, if they're valid, if people think they're valid. If the capitalists think that they're being disadvantaged, then they'll follow that, even if they're not being disadvantaged. But the important point in both these cases is that if you're thinking of a closed economy, or a more or less closed economy, the more closed the economy is, it's not going to matter. The capitalists won't make such big profits because of taxation, but insofar as the capitalist is concerned to make some profits, he's got no alternative but to invest. Things change with the degree in which capitalist the economy is globalized, the extent to which the capitalist can invest elsewhere, lower taxation, things like that, then this problem becomes, or the extent to which you can employ people who are not unionized, don't have, and can accept cheaper wages, then to all these things happen. However, just one significant point, I think, in the Offer argument. So basically, the outcome of this is whatever we think of global, to the extent to which national economies become global, the extent to which then, unless, as it were, social democracy is globalized, which is not, then individual economies are going to suffer. Individual capitalist economies are going to suffer. That's one problem. The worker thing, I think, is important. One way in which in a sense, something that socialists have always emphasized is that the wage contract is an unequal. The capitalists have a choice. Workers don't have a choice. Workers don't have the choice whether to work or not to work. They have to work, so if they have to accept some offer or other. So the more that there are non-wage benefits, the more workers, would-be workers, have a choice. So what you get is the recognition in this argument that the system works on a basic inequality in the wage contract. The more you make it equal, the more people have a choice not to work, then the more the system won't benefit, won't work, because it, in other words, is predicated on the inequality, the lack of bargaining power of the worker. And that's going to be important in the emergence of neoliberalism. Now, the other thing is, and this is a point that social democracy doesn't address, that is back then, and it's implicit in what Klaus Offer says there. Of course, for most of us, work is, not for most, for many of us, for Andrew and me, work is not simply a necessity, it's attractive. We like our work, we don't like everything about it, but we're doing work which in some way is rewarding. There's all sorts of social relations involved in the work that we value. There's also a good degree of autonomy in the work, that you work and you work out how to work and things like that. Now, one way to equalize the wage contract is a systematic attempt to make all work like that. In other words, to improve not just the material conditions of work, but to try to minimize the division between intellectual and physical labor, to actually make work something that can be, as socialists and in the early Marx thought, could be creative and productive and self-affirming. So in some sense there, this problem, one of the problems about the social democracy not addressing this issue, is one of the issues that we want to keep, is very important in any sort of the socialist agenda, that aspect. One of the things, I talked about the social democratic consensus, and I talked about, as it were, a necessary condition for that consensus, necessary background theory, was the acceptance of some form of Keynesian economic theory, some form of recognition that the government has an essential role in organizing, coordinating, and in sense interfering in the economic system. Just in passing, I think Keynes himself is a very interesting figure, and lots of things are very significant in the first half of the 20th century, in lots of respects. But he's also significant in arguing that liberalism must move away from its love of the free market, love of laissez-faire. If classical liberalism was related to sort of laissez-faire economics, Keynes is arguing in the 30s, not only he's arguing for an end to laissez-faire economics, he's arguing for a reworking of liberalism to understand the role of the state. So Keynes is important. But of course, Keynes always had his opponents. So as it were, the heart of neoliberalism is that core of economists who were classical liberals. They believed in laissez-faire. They believed in the virtues of the free market economy. So you get very smart people from these, importantly Hayek, later people have Friedman, others, very important in economic faculties. Anyway, so you get this core of economists who are always arguing against Keynes and are arguing for the virtues of classical political economy, arguing for laissez-faire. Hayek and others are making very strong and effective criticisms of totally planned economies, criticisms of the Soviet Union. Now, the interesting thing here is that these people are not just economists, they're also political philosophers. They have an argument about the nature of state power, the role of the state, the rule of law, what the laws ought to be, things like that. They also have a social philosophy, a philosophy emphasizing the importance of individual freedom of a certain kind, freedom for people to make up their own minds as to what they do, what they buy and sell and stuff like that, where they identify the main source of unfreedom, identifies the state, power that stops people doing what they want to do. So in other words, there's sort of, what you're getting at is a neoliberalism, which is not just an economic policy, an economic program, but a political and social program. And that, I think we can learn about the success of it. These are theorists who are working and not just biding their time, increasing their influence in academies and amongst politicians and people like that. So it's that the emergence of this form of neoliberalism as a comprehensive program, which is in the 60s and then becomes dominant in the late 60s, early 70s. So while we leftists were busy criticizing the welfare state, we found ourselves 10 years later defending the welfare state against much more effective criticisms. Now, so to simplify very quickly, what I've called the era of social democracy, say 20 years, 25 years, 1945, 1970, give or take a few years. A period of actually astonishingly economic development, massive economic development. Of course, there are particular reasons for the economic development, post-war period and things like that, but still, it was economic development. And a period of, to some extent, equalization of income, less in the United States than anywhere else. There were slumps, problems, all sorts of things. There was a particular problem emerging in the late 60s, early 70s, which went by the name of stagflation. That is economic stagnation, a slump, combined with inflation, where it seemed as if the normal Keynesian pump priming mechanisms were increasing inflation without actually terminating with Trump. And at that stage, a doctrine called monetarism, which you have to be very old to remember, I think it's well dead by now, associated with Milton Friedman and others, which is a particular form of neoliberal economics, became the kind of accepted wisdom of politicians and states. So you get, of course, neoliberalism takes different forms in different countries, but you get in the post-1970 periods the intellectual and political victory of neoliberalism. The intellectual political victory is such that, say, left-wing politicians like Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and otherwise simply accept the main doctrines of neoliberalism, push them in a slightly leftist direction, but only very slightly. So that becomes the accepted wisdom. So what I think is important is that the Keynesian framework was somehow replaced by something else. And just as the Keynesian framework allowed, Keynes himself was no socialist, was allowed itself to be used in a way, given the political forces operating in that post-war period, for social democratic polity. So we've got the neoliberal framework, again, successful in justifying a whole lot of attacks. No, what you get, of course, is basically all Reagan, Thatcher, all neoliberal politicians attack the welfare system, attack trade unions, attack high taxation, attack all these things so that you get the kind of world change again with sort of right-wing populism. There's another story which we can talk about. I'm sure Andrew would like to. Just one final comment, and then let's have a discussion. When we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the collapse of the Soviet Bloc, then 1989 is the key date that we now associate with that. One of the features which sort of intimated the failure of the Soviet model was it collapsed without a struggle, not with a bang, but a whimper, as T.S. Eliot would have said. In other words, there weren't people ready to fight and die or even struggle very hard for retention of the old system. Now, social democracy also collapsed without too much of a struggle. In a certain way, it left, and of course there were protests, and it wasn't over specific issues, but somehow, just as Crossland smugly in 1956 could say, all right, the social democratic consensus is what's going to last. Now we have the neoliberal consensus, which, despite populism, is still present and going to last. Part, I think, of politics now is to challenge that. Part of the politics is to rescue the past. Look and see what was worth preserving, worth rescuing about the social democratic movement, what the problems were and how they could have been confronted or changed, things like that. Okay, that's do for the time being.
Okay, so a few remarks, very few because of the time. One, and it was quite interesting how you began with the crisis of the Second World War and the war economy being an important presupposition for these experiments, though surely Sweden didn't have one, and it's not universally the one that the cause, but still, that's an interesting place to begin, especially because we're in the midst of a crisis now.
Yep.
In many respects, economically, this could be of the magnitude of the Great Depression.
Yep.
In terms of the level of governmental intrusion and entry into life, it is, we don't have rationing, well, we have rationing of health, but certainly it resembles the period you described. So the hope naturally arises whether this crisis is also not going to go to waste. That's an expression from the Obama administration, and that it will give a chance for those who wish to push a reconstruction. Nancy Fraser, who spoke here on Tuesday, used the COVID crisis in a very interesting way, and that's a part of her presentation I actually agreed with, to indicate what are the things that would potentially motivate people to want a reconstruction, because in so many areas, the neoliberal system, which already ran through a rough period just 10 years ago, is now even more shaken. And I think on the level of ideas, it is perhaps more shaken now than it was before. So we are going to have a chance. And it's a good thing we're talking about these matters here, because that's part of the process of change. You yourself have stressed the role of intellectuals, and I think they will have a role now also. So that's the first comment I want to make. The second comment is that in any case, however, we should be careful in what we advocate and what we push, because though social democracy was successful for a significant period, which presupposed post-war growth, and there may be growth now as a result of this COVID collapse, nevertheless ran into crisis phenomena, exactly as Habermas and Hofe always shown in a classical Marxist sense, on namely the very mechanisms that made it work themselves become problematic in the very process. Crisis management is Hofe's term in an essay we didn't assign, itself entered into crisis. And we have to remember that, and I would not, even though I accept your idea that the neoliberal turn in economics among the intellectuals is one of the factors in how the new regime was initiated, I think we should also always remember that the welfare state was diagnosed already in the early 70s, even before the stagflation crisis, to have crisis potential. And this is sort of systematized, because this is the kind of way Habermas writes in his legitimation crisis, where he put all these theories together. But there are lots of other people who are writing about it at the time. James O'Connor, with his fiscal crisis of the state, was perhaps the first. Daniel Bell on the cultural level, and lots of people wrote about this. We should remember it, because in any case, doing something new means doing something better. I know that in the United States, even the traditional welfare state is so poorly developed that here it's plausible to advocate that. And I think that's what Bernie Sanders, in effect, and Elizabeth Warren too have done. But I think we have to be careful. Do we want a kind of heavily bureaucratized, centralized, very expensive system to play that role, or should we think of alternatives? And I think one of the purposes of the seminar is to think of new things and not just to say, well, we can go back to the old thing, whether it is state socialism or the welfare state. And the third point, which is related to this, I just read, interestingly, I was trying to see how people even define a welfare state. Offa gives a very exact definition in one of the articles which you cite, and you basically, your analysis converged with that. But a more radical view of it, interestingly, is in Esping Anderson's book, where he relies on Karl Polanyi's theory of the commodification of three spheres of life. The welfare state is supposed to be decommodification. Now, he knows the welfare state has existed in conservative, liberal, and social democratic forms, and the liberal form surely did not decommodify labor. In other words, the requirement to participate in the laboring force was not very much reduced by the measly benefits and the very rare forms of needs-determined protections that liberal welfare state policy has produced. The United States would be a good example of this. And even though the conservative model of the welfare state, which existed since Bismarck and existed through even the Third Reich and continues in some European countries, it decommodifies more, creates more protection, but nevertheless it hierarchizes, creates new forms of stratification, corporatist ones, for example. So for Esping Anderson, it's the social democratic form that had the greatest chance to decommodify, but even this he criticizes. Because after all, even social democracy, in making peace with the wage-labor capital relationship and its private ownership, had to significantly honor the work ethic, the performance or the work-oriented conception. Neoconservatives have accused it of having eliminated the work ethic, the need to work, but you yourself have shown that on this level, whether they believed it or not, it's wrong, right? Very few people prefer welfare payments, even in Denmark, or unemployment insurance, even in the UK or in Denmark. Let's leave the United States aside, to actually working, because working itself, as you so well said, has an aspect of dignity about it, and it is not just the social consequences, the stigmas associated with welfare, but it's the not having a productive activity in the center of your life is something that people, ordinary people, hate, and they want it. And in this sense, the goal of full decommodification cannot be and should not be the goal even of welfare states. So I think we need other norms and other ideas if we're going to think about how to expand the welfare state today. And I would think that it's interesting how absent worker participation, workers' democracy, is in lots of these classical treatments. It wasn't in the 1920s, at the time when the welfare state ideal was first introduced in Weimar Republic and elsewhere. There were also democratic ideas associated with it. This, I think, is not a characteristic of the British welfare state. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, there are some pockets of worker ownership, worker participation in profits. Germany has co-determination, which involved a certain amount of union participation always in the management structure. But certainly this aspect, the democratic dimension, was not developed. It remained, basically the democratic aspect of the welfare state was in the hands of parties and unions. And I think in some sense, if you're going to rethink this model, we should not abandon the idea that work is a very important feature of people's lives. You stressed that. And of course, maybe humanization and even transformation of work. should be part of the proposal. That's what you said yourself. And I think participation in management and even property, I would say, would be an additional important aspect. It's interesting how it's in the state socialist countries, well, Yugoslavia, on which we had a very good presentation here, and also to some extent in Poland and elsewhere, did the idea come up that socialism should involve not the replacement of one form of property, namely private ownership of the means of production, by state property, as in the Soviet Union and even China at the most radical times, but rather should involve a plurality of property forms. And that idea, I think, is perhaps another one with which one can enrich this tradition at a moment, but it has a chance to come back. It has a chance to come back. I mean, Bernie Sanders lost, right, candidacy, but he has won the ideological battle. No Democratic candidate is going to now be able to neglect all the issues that he has raised. So we're at a time when a lot of things can be done. As Elizabeth Warren said about Biden, his greatest virtue is that he's a good listener. Remember that? She just said that, which means he's going to listen to us. And that means us here too. But we need to have something to say in order to be worth listening to. So I stop with that. And Ross, it's up to you. If you want to say anything more, please.
Oh, a couple of things. I'm glad Nancy made the point about the present pandemic. If you read the Wall Street Journal, which is a pretty depressing experience, but that's a neoliberal journal, coming to awkward terms with Trump. But they are dead scared that the precedent of state action that's taking place, the level of state action now won't stop and will continue and increase. In other words, they can't wait to wind it down. They've got to be stopped straight away. And that's a real scare. Another thing I've learned from the Wall Street Journal, ever since Bernie mentioned Sweden, they've been spending time with articles on Sweden, how awful it is. And they had a very interesting piece the other day comparing Sweden with New York City. And they're saying, well, Sweden's getting away with all this stuff because people trust each other there. They don't free ride. In New York, which is a lively place with lots of different kinds of people here, we don't trust each other, so we've got to have the government telling us to do these things. And somehow the comparison there was to come out in favor of New York. And but the message was, wouldn't it be great to live in, wouldn't it be nicer to live in a place where people trusted each other? And wouldn't it be nice if, yeah, the world was such, it doesn't have to be a matter of size. It happens in moments of crisis and things like that, where people can learn to rely on others and not be free riders. So that's a kind of, the issue, the welfare state depended on some limited form of national sovereignty and national self-sufficiency. And I really don't know how that's a big problem. How you can move towards some more humane, decent set of relationships in the world, the economic world as it is now. I don't know so much about commodification. Oh, the whole lot of stuff previous about fiscal crisis of the state and stuff like that. We can talk about. I don't believe in it. I believe basically the various problems that people found in the economics of the welfare state were overstated. That the problems that could have been resolved, but the labor process thing, yeah, I think people do want to work. something Keynes thought years ago. He predicted 50, 60 years that people would have to, everyone could work and only work 12 or 14 hours a week, something like that. Now, Americans now work longer hours, not this moment, but than they used to. The amount of time that people who do work has increased. Now, the fact that people want to work for various reasons, not having a job is a social stigma. It's not simply money, but it's something, an identity which most people have. The thing is that we might try and get us work towards a situation where work is more fulfilling for more people, and also where work is shared amongst more people. So that now, I'm not sure. That's something that is part of a kind of socialist vision, which I'm very reluctant to give up. I think that's it.
Yeah, so we need to have time. Just a very short answer. Even if you don't buy the thesis of the fiscal crisis, the crisis of the welfare state, nevertheless, you can't put all the weight on intellectuals for its dramatic weakening. So I think that in that case, at least you have to stick to the level of globalization, which would sound like this. If capitalist investors think that there's a fiscal crisis, think that that the profitability domestically is interfered by the welfare state, and if they have a large globe to shift their investments, then in effect you have the crisis of the welfare state anyway. Of course, you see this with the taxation systems all over Europe. Everybody has to reduce taxes because otherwise the company leaves. So I think it's important. When we used to be Marxists, we always stressed the objective factor, the objective aspect, and we didn't put all the weight on ideology. I think we were right to do so. And here the objective aspects can be discussed just purely domestically or internationally. But I think we better have them, because otherwise we will say that Friedman and his cohorts created neoliberalism, which to a Marxist, maybe to a Hegelian that sounds okay, but to a Marxist it would not be really very plausible. So let me open the floor. Let's have about 2 or 3 student responses after one another. I will stay out of the discussion. I will just moderate it, and then Ross will come in each time. Okay?
So I'm wondering, and the question is for either of you, why are we talking about the welfare state as a kind of thing that's demised and is certainly something that is, we have to look at it from a kind of like it's in the past. And connected to that, my question would be, what's going on in Sweden? And is that still not a great place? I mean, if I wanted to immigrate to Sweden, would that still not be a great place to live? It sounds from the presentation as if Sweden is, no longer doing what it's supposed to. So I'm just wondering, what's the idea behind the concept that the welfare state is absolutely certainly on its, deathbed?
Anybody else? Okay, Arya.
Thank you, Ross and Andrew. I had a question about, so if we want about social democracy and how we want to revive it in some way. So I was wondering also about so besides all the contradictions that Ross and Andrew you both talked about, I was also thinking, I was reading Hobsbawm, and then what he talked about was about the internal contradictions of capitalism itself too, and the fact that the emergence of transnational capitalism and, for example, the offshore financing that started from the 1960s and now was a major factor in the rise of neoliberalism, of course, too. And so if we want to think about a kind of a democratic socialism or social democracy, how can we think about the revival in some way of the Bretton Woods institutions, and not just as economic institutions, but as international democratic political institutions, in order to in some way control the capital in some way. And also, I think connected to this, my second question is about, so if, again, social democracy and the welfare state is based on, nation states, and then how isn't this then become related to the crisis of immigration too? So how can we manage in some way, have a democratic politics in nation states based on immigration-friendly politics, and also, and at the same time, a social democratic welfare state in each political entity?
Well, it's the part of the man's question that I respond to is Sweden now. Sweden's sort of radical. Sweden is interesting, important. Partly had almost 50 years of uninterrupted social democratic rule. In other words, a period where policies could be put in place that sort of more or less continued, up and down. That came to an end in the 80s. I've forgotten the dates, and there was a banking crisis. And also sort of problems related to the fact that Sweden is a very small country. One of the features that I find very interesting is that the Swedes were, towards the end, had an idea of what they called labor funds. So the idea was the trade unions had agreed that money would be put aside from the taxation of companies and things like that, and put into wage funds, which wouldn't go to wages for the workers, would go to assets in the enterprises. So there was actually a move towards some form of at least legal workers' control. Now, that didn't happen, and it was around about that time that the Swedish bourgeoisie began really to bucket the kind of system which they'd sort of gone along with in some way for various reasons. But the history is sort of, I don't know enough about the detail, but the banking crisis in around about the late 1980s, which led to a reform which meant that the actual financial policies began to change. Taxation levels went down. Now, in terms of a welfare state, by ordinary standard, or the level of inequality's gone up incredibly. However, in terms of basic standard of living for people, it's incredibly much higher than anywhere else. So in terms of provisions of education, health, and things like that, it's very, very good indeed. And so that, if you go there, you'll be better off, almost certainly. And also, the Swedes are very nice people.
Let me address this thing, because he's very happy with your answer, but I think it's wrong. It's not that he's wrong about Sweden, but I think for you to pick out Sweden in this context is crazy. I mean, we're talking about a lot of countries. We're talking about a lot of countries. We're talking about also the United States. You're an economist, So all you got to look up is the budgets being spent on social welfare across the board. I don't know about the Swedish one, but in general, it's a tremendous cut of that kind of spending. Now, welfare states, if they're already established, cannot just be dismantled totally. Mrs. Thatcher could not do that. She attacked the national health system, but she could not dismantle it. She could fund it on a much lower level. So if you're an economist, I think that you'd have to kind of look at that. Now, the most important aspect of this is Europe. Social Europe was the project in the epoch of the welfare state. There's a blog, which I think you should all kind of look at. It's called Social Europe. It's a very good blog. In the period of the classical welfare state, when the most important development of the European Union occurred, it was assumed that states would spend a great deal on social spending. In the neoliberal period, systematically, the stress has gone in another direction. You saw that in the case of the Greek, for the main European institutions and some of the major governments as well. So I think to actually ask this question and ask it only about Sweden, I mean, yeah, okay, Norway would have been a better example, actually, if you really wanted to make the point, because Norway has enormous oil resources, and actually standard of living is higher in Norway than in Sweden, and even smaller and even more homogeneous country. Yes, Denmark, where I've been, is very, very nice. If I wanted to be an immigrant from somewhere around the world, I would certainly go to Denmark. It's a very nice place, and healthcare is still in good shape. But to actually say that there is no crisis because you look at Sweden, I think is just mistaken. And you're an economist, Damon, so just look up the numbers. I think would be, a sufficient way of showing that there has been a crisis. That crisis is responded differently in different places, but it is an issue, and you can't just say, well, you know, the welfare state was really great, it's still there, why worry? United States would be a significant example of there has been a crisis. And I think what we are experiencing now, you know, after 20 or even 30 years of cuts in all these areas, is a consequence of there having been also, even in the United States, a crisis of this kind. Okay, I will not say more.
So just one more kind of connected comment, and that is, I think the question of budgets, and the question, I think this is one of the eternal questions that I see come up again and again in your discourse, and that is, can the implementation in small countries, which are of population levels of one state of the United States, could such a model be replicated in a country which is, you know, 300 million versus 10 million? And I think that's a kind of thing we see again and again. But I mean, yeah, that's just my observation. But if I could just add one more thing, I think your point was, in fact, that the US has a much larger budget and is, in fact, not deficient in its capacity to provide welfare. So I think if I can make a final point, a statement on this, I think where we'll really see where this thing can or cannot be done feasibly is probably in China, because that's another huge country, and if they can do it with 1 billion people, then we would have no excuse to say why we couldn't do it with 320 million in North America.
But we're going to have Ying Chen speaking about exactly this problem. And if you look at the readings, she has a health system, and she's going to give a very strong critique of what in this period was done to the healthcare system. But I would say, given the little reading I've done on that, is that in the communist period, and Cuba would be, of course, another example, but it's a very small country. But in the communist period, there were a lot of things done in China which produced better healthcare than in the current period of capitalist transformation. Now, China is going to have to deal with this if it doesn't want to explode. And I think they will deal with it. So I don't think it's a question necessarily of a country's size. First of all, you can also have federalism and think about the country as having separate units, which can each, like a small country, solve the problem. California is big and responded to the COVID much, much better than some small states. It's not a question of just big and small.
Something about, I want to say a word in favor of bureaucracies. And I want to say a word against, there's a sense in which workers' self-management, community, all sorts of ways in which democracy, a whole lot of things work better when they're small. So you think, okay, the fewer decisions that are made at the top, the more decisions that are made at the bottom, the better, something like that sort of rule. So a lot of the criticisms of the social welfare state was the way the bureaucracy worked, the rule-governed nature of it, the fact that rules had to be followed. Bureaucrats had to go through a list of entitlements, whether you were entitled or not entitled, and stuff like that. Now, I'm sure this sort of stuff can be handled a lot better, but any system that's going to work on any kind of large scale is got to have that kind of problem. You're always going to have roughly scarce resources. You've got to have ways of administering those and providing access to them and things like that. So you need some sort of rule, some sort of, in the matter of trade union, something I mentioned in passing, if you have, and this certainly happened in the days of monopoly capitalism, where I remember in Australia, we've got any Australians, but this was in the distant past, when you had a strong waterside workers federation run by a very active band of clever communists. And you had basically a monopoly system of ships coming in, where the waterside workers did very well in terms of work conditions and things like this, simply because they were well organized and could use their organizational power to get good deals. And they could get good deals partly because the shipping companies were in a monopoly position, so they were in a position to give good deals. It was easier to give good deals and just pass the costs on. So there's a sort of way in which on any sort of socialist system, any sort of social democracy system, they'll say, okay, let's even things out a bit. What about the people working in unions that aren't strong or are non-unionized? How are you going to pass things over? Now, one of the things that was tried in Australia in the late 1980s, when there's a Labor government, it was the government was trying to do tripartite deals and do deals with the trade union movement as a whole, and also with business and the government, to try and work out ways in which particular unions would not use their power to get better wages and conditions. In other words, wage benefits, if there could be some general agreement that non-wage benefits would be provided over a broader range of people. In other words, this was used to introduce a national superannuation system. But it's also a system by which you get union leaders doing deals with the government, with corporations. In the meantime, on the shop floor, people saying, what about us? What about us? There's a real problem there. But the problem is kind of inevitable. Somehow you've got to have a system which does equalize things out. And sometimes that means overriding the interests of small groups, particular groups within it, who may be able to benefit. Now, so I'm not sure there's a rubric to handle that kind of system, but then I think in the years of the welfare state, the term bureaucracy, bureaucratic, became a term of criticism. I think we might go back to Weber and think, well, might try and sort of revive a notion where bureaucracy can be something we all recognize as important. That is important to get some kind of equality between groups, things like that. I'm not sure how clear that, and I'm not sure whether Aria, that was really what he had in mind, but I made a note of a question of bureaucratic socialism. Look, one of the things here, one of the things in is that, of course, some elements of the welfare state exists in every capitalist system, even
what? I'm not hearing this. The cross.
Some elements of the welfare state exists everywhere.
Yeah.
What happened, as you mentioned, Margaret Thatcher wasn't able. She was able to gut the education system, gut all sorts of systems. Nevertheless, national health system, she was able to diminish its ability, defund it, but not get rid of it completely. So that, you know, there's more or less welfare. So it's a kind of...
Listen, I mean, Ross, I know the United States still has Social Security established in the 1930s. I also know it has Medicare and Medicaid. I also know there is national unemployment insurance. So no one has maintained that it has disappeared and we are back in some kind of laissez-faire utopia, which didn't exist in the 19th century either, because then there were survivals from the previous period. So when we're talking about its crisis, which I think now you want to kind of deny, and we want to say that it had economic reasons, which were also part of it. I mean, that's a discussion that one can't short circuit by saying, oh, there's still a national health service in Britain. By the way, there's also private insurance now in Britain. It has become a dual system. So has Canada. So in fact, you know, I don't know about Sweden. I don't know about the Scandinavian countries, but almost everywhere the system has changed. And just because there's survivals from the past, bigger or smaller, is not indication of anything. The important thing is that the systems have changed, and to the extent the trend until 2008, let's say, or until Bernie Sanders even had a chance to run for anything, right? Because he was a senator for a long time. No one ever imagined until the crisis of 2008 that he could run. And now with the COVID, right? So until this particular time, the trend was exactly toward cutting programs, taking investments to countries where the interest, where the tax rates are low and there is little regulation. That's the point Aria was making. Globalization has allowed for an alternative strategy of capitalist reconstruction, and that's the trend we were in. Neoliberalism is a terrible term because so many things from Pinochet to Clinton are included under it. But yes, it was a kind of neoliberal epoch of some kind, and we were in it until just a few months ago. We're not in it now. We're in a period of deep crisis for that neoliberal epoch. It's a very serious crisis. But until the COVID crisis, we were still in this thing, right? And yes, the fact that Clinton won the candidacy and that even now Biden is the one who wins indicates that the idea of centrist democratic crisis management away from the New Deal model has been hegemonic for a period. It's that hegemony that we have to some extent confront. Now, that's not the topic of this course. The topic of this course is what else can we offer in its place? And I don't think being a traditional socialist is going to be, in spite of the fact that neither Bernie Sanders nor Alexander Ocasio-Cortez actually even really know what that is. But even if they, to the extent that they know, that's not the thing to offer. And in that sense, our job is to figure out something a little different, a little newer, something with elements which have not yet been tried, or at least combinations that haven't been tried. That's the purpose of this seminar. I kind of lament that very little of that has come out of it. Nancy is the only one who really tried. She's the only one who really tried. A lot of things she says cannot be maintained if one really thinks about economics seriously enough. For example, this three-sectoral model of the economy, where investments are democratically managed, where fundamental human needs are met through some kind of rationing system, and where there's a middle range in which there is a free exchange of commodities through a market. This is an untenable model. But she actually tried, and she expanded the notion of both capitalism and socialism. Not many people in the seminar so far have tried that. And I think that's a problem, but I think we have to continue. But I think, the reason why I'm vociferous about not being really, too wide-eyed about the welfare state that existed for the 30 glorious years. And surely we need not be wide-eyed about state socialism. The reason is that we really need in this situation something which is plausible and which will not be an important aspect of Nancy's presentation, which is not new because it's there in Klaushofer in the 80s or 70s, but we should remember it, that the social actors who we're supposed to link projects to are not the same as before. We can't.
Look, can I just come in?
Let me just finish the sentence. We cannot base things on the industrial working class as the agent. There are new social movements, new actors, and it is also their conceptions which should be thought about when we think about new strategies. Yes, Ross, go ahead.
Look, can I pick up? No, we can't go back to the industrial working class as the agent. What I should have said was the importance of the industrial working class in the early days of the British social welfare state was they were a coordinated movement. And what we have now is lots of different movements, but very little by way of coordination. Now, that was a coordinated movement which had other things associated with it. It wasn't just the industrial working class, they did other things which benefited other people. We can't go back to that. The industrial working class doesn't exist in the same way it did then. It hasn't the position. But the other question here is what's feasible and what's not. And yeah, my point before is that what's feasible not is generally a political matter, not an economic matter or something like that. But I think what's feasible in this country, most countries I know of under conditions of globalization, are a universal health system. Yeah, most countries have it. A universal social welfare system, which is actually a good deal more generous and simple than any non-wage benefits in this country. A point that, what's his name, someone made talking about Sweden, there's a trade-off between full employment and poverty. You think full employment means no poverty. In fact, countries which have near to full employment, like the United States, have a massive amount of poverty because a lot of the jobs are ones that don't deliver anything like a decent standard of living. Countries which have, like France, which have a high level of employment, have a low level of poverty because of the level, they have a high level of employment, various problems which the current regime there is trying to resolve. But sort of here is work is important, but then if work's going to be important, then you need conditions where work is decently paid, and you also need conditions where people who don't work have enough to live on. And this is a point that Titmuss made, which the welfare state didn't live up to. You need some sort of way of providing these, so it's provided as rights of citizenship, not as favors done to the disadvantaged or the weak. In other words, something that's written. Now, all those things, that's not socialism by a long shot, but it's something should be part of a socialist project. And it's all of those are feasible economically in certainly countries like this one or other ones. It's a political matter of getting support and things like that.
You see, my feeling is that you're right, and it's especially plausible for you to say what you say because we're in the United States. So we had some system of universal health care. Nevertheless, it's significant that the party has shifted. That's what Sanders and Warren have done, and that's the point here. It would take 3 presidencies to do any of these things in the United States, and 3 well-handled presidencies. So we really have something like a period of 12 years, minimally. The New Deal, how long did it take to do? In fact, the healthcare thing never was done in the New Deal. So it takes really several in this kind of system, unless you want to go and take state power and then you want to institute everything from above through bureaucracies. Well, go ahead. But in any case, in a system such as it is, it would take 3 presidencies, 4 to actually accomplish all this. My problem is then we wind up saying what Crossland said in the text that Ross assigned. Okay, now we have nothing more to do. It's done. What else are we going to do? We're going to just protect this. Social democracy turned conservative in the 70s. In the midst of economic phenomena, which Ross doesn't think were real, they said, well, let's just protect what we have. Let's just guard it. And nothing new emerged out of social democracy for a very long time. And that is a losing strategy if you have accomplished things in a certain period. And the people who have these things, as Ross himself said, are not grateful, and then you're not very popular. The welfare state is not popular in any country. Nationalism is popular in lots of places, right? So what else are you going to do then? And it seems to me that we also got to think about that. And it's not going to be collective ownership of means of production and central planning. I tell you that, because if that's what the long-term program is, then you might as well get ready for the grave.
Andrew, I think there's another conversation. I'm interested in central planning. I think central planning is crucial. Central planning is crucial.
What do you mean by it?
That's a good question. Central planning, it's a question of how much central planning and what detail. Do I mean central planning to take the place of all market decisions or all particular decisions? No, of course not. But there's got to be some degree of central planning.
Ross, the Federal Reserve centrally plans.
What?
We have central planning in the U.S. right now. The Federal Reserve
centrally plans. So we all believe in some degree of central planning.
Everybody,
how much central planning?
That's why it's not, the point need not be made. That's why it need not be made. But if your socialist makes it, then me, who's from a place which had it, has all kinds of ideas which are, which sound, very, very dangerous. Mm-hmm. If you are from Australia, maybe central planning, what's the problem? You can have a little more, a little less. Mm-hmm. But the socialist tradition meant something by it. And for 70 years, it was realized. And to say, okay, well, we don't mean quite as much of it. That's not really a great answer. Now, if you mean that certain priorities of the collective economy will be set through some democratic discussions, and it will involve some fundamental choices, how much budget for the welfare system and how much budget for accumulation. If a few things, yeah, okay, we could have a little more. France has had this for a very long time, and I'm sure the Swedes also. But I mean, you know, when you say central planning in this tradition, you're talking about, you know, stuff which is really, you know, anybody who knows how it worked. And I recommend János Kornai's work because we had a good presentation here. Be well worth discussing what central planning and its consequences are in a system which really has it. And I don't mean the Federal Reserve. Okay, I think we're gonna have to call it quits. So let's meet again, and Ross, we will have other chances to discuss these issues.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going off to have a drink. Bye-bye.
Thanks.